everybody, my name is Bethany. Welcome to the Beauty of Pastel. I am so glad that you are here. For today's video, I am going to be answering some more of your questions all about pastel painting and really being an at-home, stay-at-home working artist in my studio. So for today, I got some really great questions specifically about other supplies that I use in my studio that aren't necessarily pastels. Of course, if you know anything about pastels, here I am sitting by my main palette, and there's a lot of other stuff on it too because I'm going to show it to you in a second. But whenever you're working with pastels, you're not only using those pure pigment sticks. You also, or I do anyway, use quite a plethora of other materials and tools to help me really achieve the results that I like. So I'm just going to jump right into it. A lot of times people are surprised that I use painting tools like palette knives and brushes with my pastels. A couple of weeks ago, I had another great question about why some artists, pastelists, call it painting and some people call it drawing, and it's really kind of a personal choice. And yes, even though we're using dry pigment, I like to call it painting. And oftentimes I use painting, wet paint products and tools like brushes and palette knives in my work. Of course, a lot of the pastel building and the layers that we want on the page, I like to use what's called an underpainting, which is usually a wet type of wash on the surface of the paper. Of course, in order to work with wet watercolors or sometimes ink washes, brushes come in handy, and I love to use fan brushes and also flats. I also really like to use palette knives. This one is so worn down, you can see how flat it is because I like to scratch into the layers of the pastel sometimes to create some fun, very thin effects, grasses or tree trunks or branches. Now, another thing that I cannot do without on any kind of painting is a very cheapy mechanical pencil. I love to sketch in my major shapes with the graphite, and I like to use a mechanical pencil because the sanded paper that I use wears down any kind, it's sandpaper, so it's wearing down any kind of tip or point on a sharpened pencil. So the mechanical pencil really saves me a lot of time. It blends very well with the dry pastel layers. You can't see it. I'm using a pretty light mark, and I just really love them. Now, another tool that I've recently started using is just this rubber brush that's almost like a little squeegee, and this can get you some really fun marks and effects in your underpainting and even in some final layers of pastel. So check these out. Whenever you go to your craft store, look around and just see what you think may help you get and achieve some texture. Since we can't build our paint up thickly because it's dry, we have to kind of fake the texture or get the texture in different ways. A lot of times that's through mark making and of course the brush effects of the underpainting and different tools. Now, oftentimes I get lots of questions about this crazy stuff right here. This is called gap filler, and I use this as a blending tool and sometimes even to get some paintbrush effects. I love this because it comes in this really big roll. The gap filler or foam is a really closed cell foam, so it's really nice and smooth. And since I'm working on sanded papers, that sandpaper can really kind of make your fingers sore if you rub on it too much. And so this pipe foam or this gap filler really helps me avoid any kind of sore fingers. Now, there is another kind that is black that's more of a pipe foam insulation. It actually goes around a pipe, and you can find those in really long, big tubes. I prefer this kind because it doesn't flake off quite as much on the paper, and also because I can rip it easily and it doesn't have an inside edge that has a sticky side that I have to cut off. I can also rinse these off and reuse them, so I think these are a little bit better in the studio. Of course, some other things I use all the time is tape. I love to use regular masking tape to tape my paper onto my backer board. Make sure if you put this on the front of the paper, really test it, because sometimes some of the grit can kind of come off when you peel this away. Since I mostly use UArt papers and other really high professional grade papers, I have tested it and the masking tape doesn't affect them, but make sure you check before you apply it to your specific paper. You don't want it to rip off. I also love to use this black artist tape. This one really just helps me get a really nice clean edge at the end if I want to test the crop or if I want to imagine it framed. Then I can just tape over those messy edges and it creates a really nice clean finish. Of course, another thing that I like to use is a utility knife. I have a big roll of sanded paper that's probably almost as big as me. It's a little over 5 feet tall and it's really big, and I have to cut the paper myself, and I could not do that without my utility knife. One tip about cutting, especially for cutting UArt sanded paper, if you cut on the back side, on the opposite side of the grit, your blade will stay sharper. If you cut on the side with the grit, your blade will dull really, really quickly. So just keep that in mind. Of course, if you're cutting your paper yourself, you're going to need a self-healing mat or something to protect the surface underneath the X-Acto knife or the utility blade, and also a straight edge. You can use a yardstick or some kind of T-square or a triangle, anything that has a really nice, sturdy, straight edge. A couple of other things that I love to use that aren't necessarily pastel are some watercolors. You can see how messy my little watercolor palette is. I am not precious about my watercolor because I don't consider, whenever I'm doing a watercolor underpainting, I'm not trying to employ the techniques of very fine watercolor artists. I'm more using the watercolor to tone the surface in my big main shapes, usually trees, sky, and land, the 3 planes that we have. I spray it off with water. I use the palette really messy, and it's so much fun. I do like to use a certain type of watercolor, and make sure you check out, I don't know that I mentioned it, but make sure you check out, I have lots of links to these different products below. Another thing that I love to use, which you've seen me use before, are these acrylic ink pots to really help me get another type of underpainting. Usually when I'm using these versus the watercolor, I'm going for a little bit darker or more opaque look in that underpainting. Whenever I use this, I also, where is it? Oh, here it is. I also use a spray water bottle because I need to thin this out a little bit. Just make sure if you're using UArt or if you're using paper that you haven't really tested water on, just make sure that you apply a very, very small amount of water because it can buckle your paper. Of course, I love to use rubbing alcohol. I usually use 91% isopropyl alcohol when I'm going for more of a hard pastel underpainting. That's whenever you've seen me brush on or swipe on the hard pastel and then go back over it with some kind of brush to create a really nice drippy effect. Once again, I'm usually going for a very blocked in effect, trying to get my value map correct in the very first stage. Sometimes I get asked here, do I use any type of final fixative? And I do not, and have not used a final fixative, although I do know some artists that really like to use a final fixative. For me, I use a fairly light touch, and so I don't have a lot of pastel that's going to fluff off of my page, thankfully. And so usually if I just tap lightly on the back of the paper, any excess pastel will dislodge, and then I can frame it behind glass. However, since we're talking about fixatives, I do like to use what's called a workable fixative sometimes, especially if I need a specific area of my painting to have a slightly darker value, especially the shadow areas under trees and bushes, really dark shadowed. Sometimes if the values are not quite far apart enough, I like a lot of contrast. Then I will just spritz a few little short bursts on those areas with Workable Fixative. There are many different brands. The one I use is below. That will help my values settle down a little bit. Sometimes it gives your painting a little bit of depth. Just be careful. This is very highly toxic stuff. It smells like spray paint. It is not fun if you're in a room with it and you get really bad headaches. So I like to do it outside in my garage. And if I have to be in my studio, I open all the windows and then I leave the room. Just make sure you don't breathe this stuff in. It's not safe. I have various little cups in the studio for water and alcohol. Of course, I have most of my pastels here, although I am working on a new system to try to uncover them. They're kind of piled in a little mountain right now, and I need a little bit more room for them all to breathe. So those are some other tools that I use for almost every painting, depending on the underpainting and how I approach the very beginning stages of a piece. For the most part, those are the tools that I use across the board. I hope you have learned something today. Thank you so much for being here and for tuning in every week. I've really enjoyed releasing some of these lessons to you and demonstrations to you here on YouTube. Thank you so much for your comments and your likes and for your shares and for your subscriptions and for hitting that little notification bell. I appreciate it so much. For those of you that are interested in learning more about pastel, having a little bit more of a one-on-one with me, especially if you're a member of my studio circle over on Patreon, the link is right here. I love to give critiques. I love to help my students who really have become so much of my family and my friends. So check that out if you haven't. Every little bit helps support this content to come out, and I thank all of you so much.